Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program, The Dangers of Gender Ideology at Home and Abroad. Please welcome Dr. James J. Carafano, Senior Counselor to the President and E.W. Richardson Fellow at the Heritage Foundation.
Good morning. I'd like to thank everyone here and our really vast audience that's tuning in online. You know, I often think when we think about global issues, we think about issues about foreign policy and national security and trade. But in the modern world in which we live, so many of the global issues affect our children, our family, and our communities. And the consequences of these can be so incredibly important and dramatic on our freedom, on our liberty, on our relationship with God, and on our relationship with other countries. And so we thought it was incredibly important to take a moment and bring together global voices to talk about what is going on probably one of the most sensitive and important issues that affect all our lives. And so we're really pleased to host this event today and to listen to a diversity of voices from many different places on a really important issue about how do we treat our fellow citizens, how do we treat our children, how do we treat our families. And so I want to begin by welcoming to the stage Peter Tucci, the director of the Center for Fundamental Rights, to make some opening comments. And then we're going to have two really engaging and informative panels. So I hope you enjoy the program and find it enriching and fulfilling. So Peter, let me ask you to take the stage and kick us off.
Thank you, Jim. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you for being here. And I also want to thank you, Jim, for hosting this joint event. It is really important to showcase for the public that we can work together, Americans and Hungarians, in such crucial matters, what the danger of gender ideology means. And actually, my feeling is that there are only two places currently in the West where gender ideology can be discussed and challenged. And one of that is, of course, Hungary, and the other one is the US. And it shows us how strongly the woke mob took over the public discourse in the West. And many in the Western world remain silent when confronting this toxic ideology, despite of the fact that this ideology is now attacking our children, the most vulnerable and most exploitable humans in the world. But this is not what real conservatives in Hungary and America do. As soon as we have the right tools in our hands, we do what needs to be done. Where I come from in Hungary, the conservatives define marriage as the union of a man and a woman and elevated this protection to a constitutional level. The Hungarian fundamental law also states that the mother is a woman and the father is a man, which has been so obvious for a long period of time that sounds ridiculous that it needs constitutional protection. But these days we are living in a very delusional world, which demonstrates us that even basic and fundamental truth needs constitutional law protection, and countries in the Western world with common sense mindset should give the highest level of protection for our most sacred values like family, marriage, and protection of children. But the left questions the order of creation, and this dark movement, if I may say, now has too much power in our eyes. But I hope not for long. We know that American conservatives are fighting for their kids with the same determination that we are. And thank you, Heritage Foundation, again, for being at the forefront of this fight in America. Even as representatives of a small but proud nation, we too are inspired by our courageous American friends in that issue. And let us recall just one example from the US. The state of Florida is a pioneer in standing up for children and protecting traditional common sense-based values. Uniting against gender ideology is not only a choice, but it's our duty. The left struck at the very foundation of our Judeo-Christian civilization. The West rose to greatness because it built its social order on a rock. Our founding principles were consistent with the will of the Creator, but the progressives are challenging that very foundation. We are suffering an institutional moral security crisis because the progressives have undermined our collective immune system, which is sustained by the God-given values of the West. And we must defend these values and undo the damage that has been done. Of course, there are those on the left who care little about values and principles. For them, wokeness is a tool of oppressive power. And some of them, I think, don't really believe in that insanity they preach, but by forcing you to submit to these delusional demands, they hope they can demonstrate an overwhelming power and silence the majority. And actually, the sad truth is that to a certain extent, they have been successful by silencing common sense, regular voices of the Western world. And consider just how this alliance of woke people, politicians, big media, big tech, and big pharma forced half of the world a couple of years ago into a lockdown over a virus with a 99% survival rate. Just a few examples, like Canada or Australia, were turned into COVID tyrannies. The left used big tech to eliminate all dissonant voices and forced to a total obedience on most people. And these woke cultists tore apart communities and isolated people for at least 2 years. And mark my words, soon they will try to impose gender ideology with the same iron fist. The foundation of our Judeo-Christian culture is being torn down brick by brick. First, we were lectured that religion is not important anymore. Then they said that patriotism is just the first step to toxic nationalism. After that, they told us that marriage is just a social construct, but at the same time, they demanded for same-sex couples. Recently, they have forced us to accept the crazy idea that there are a countless number of genders. And recently, they started to go after our children, which is the most dangerous part of this toxic ideology. But as a leading Hungarian conservative politician keeps saying, sometimes we should praise ourselves. And dear friends, Hungary took already its fair share in child protection and combating gender ideology. The Hungarian conservative leadership stopped this ideology at the gates of kindergartens and schools because it is most important to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And now the Hungarian parliament will further strengthen and extend child protection measures, including constitutional amendments, which was introduced by the Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago. American and Hungarian mothers and fathers know best how to raise their kids. And it is utmost important to take back that right to us and not leave the parental rights and the rights to choose the future of kids to school boards and other non-elected NGOs. And we should not let that happen to influence our kids by mainstream media, big corporation, and woke governments. If ordinary citizens can triumph over big brands like Target with its rainbow propaganda, or Bud Light selling transgenderism instead of a beer, then common sense can take back the White House and drain the swamp in Brussels. And it is very important to address these two cities currently, because not only you guys going to have presidential elections here in the United States, but we in Europe going to have a European parliamentary election when the electorate, those common sense-based thinking people, can make a change and make a difference in both continents of the Atlantic, in DC and in Brussels as well. And we should join forces to make that happen. We should join forces to have an impact on decision makers and leadership on both sides of the Atlantic. And that is why my organization, the Center for Fundamental Rights, are organizing the only European CPAC Hungary, on the third time in a row, this April, the 25th and 22nd, which serves as an umbrella event for all of the common sense conservatives from all across the Atlantic, from the United States and from Europe as well. And I see some friendly faces from Poland and Italy here who are regular attendees from the European side of our umbrella event, which is crucially important because the two elections this year in the US and in Europe as well. So ladies and gentlemen, let's join forces and act together because our children's lives are at stake and we should defend them by any means. Thank you for your attention. And let me give the floor to Jay Richards, who is the moderator of the next European panel. Thank you again.
Well, thank you so much for joining us either in person or online. Those of you that have been following Heritage's work for the last few years know this is an issue of abiding concern for us, certainly domestically, both at the federal level and at the state level. And in fact, most of the activity, honestly, over the last few years has actually been in the state level. The reality is, though, under the current administration, gender ideology is one of our main exports, unfortunately. That's the kind of basic reality of the situation. And if you talk to Europeans, or in fact, almost anyone that follows this in another country, they generally perceive that this is an American export. And I don't think that's honestly that unfair. Most of the kind of leading lights that have articulated and developed the conceptual apparatus for gender ideology come from the US. Now, I would want to point out that there's some blame among certain German and French philosophers that might have been adopted, but nevertheless, it's the Americans that sort of converted cultural Marxism and neo-Marxism into the application of the human body and sex. So what is gender ideology exactly? Just think of this distilled as a particular proposition. It's the proposition that sex, that is the reproductive strategy of plants and animals and many other organisms, which involves the fusion of gametes of different sizes and reproductive systems that correspond to those gametes. That's sex, right? This idea that it's a thing that's real in the biological world, that ultimately doesn't capture human reality and human experience. But rather, if we want to understand human beings and all of their variety and diversity, it's much better to think in terms of an entirely internal, subjective, psychological state called a gender identity. What is that? That is an internal sense of gender. So yeah, that's circular as a definition because you've got gender on both sides. That's the best we can do in terms of understanding this idea. So all of us are really these kind of disembodied psychological selves that have a sense of our gender. And then you might think, okay, so what is sex? Well, sex is a social construct. It's an imposition that comes from doctors who learned at some point to use stereotypes in which they associate certain body parts with either male or female. But it's an assignment, it's a construct, it's a convention, it's not the real thing. And so therefore, if this is right, it's possible that your gender identity might be incongruent with your sex assigned at birth. And so now, of course, under the kind of medical regime that interprets this and applies it, the proper way to treat someone who experiences this incongruence, if it's truly debilitating, is not to adjust the psychological state of the mind to the body, is to transform the social surroundings, the names, the pronouns, and the body to conform to an internal sense of gender. Now, I want to know who the winner of the Nobel Prize was that discovered this thing called a gender identity. That would be an extraordinary thing, that suddenly this idea that had never occurred to anyone, in fact, it still has not occurred to almost anyone until 15 minutes ago, suddenly would work its way through our international institutions and dominate most of the countries of the West. So that's what we're here to discuss. And I can say, as Americans, we very often don't realize how this is playing out in other countries. And so I'm delighted to be the moderator of an august panel of guests from other countries. I've already gotten pre-permission to botch the pronunciation of their names. So we'd already talked about this. So I have, Hungarians and Poles are on this panel, and so you know how this is going to go exactly. So let me briefly introduce our panelists. First is Ernesto Arroyo, who is the international advisor of the Decencio Foundation. The Decencio Foundation is a Madrid-based think tank focused on the promotion of conservative values in Spain and in the wider Iberosphere, which we will talk about. He's a career diplomat and was the Minister of Foreign Affairs between 2019 and 2021 in the government of President Bolsonaro. And he's also served as a strategic advisor in the international arena. My friend Jerzy Kwasniewski is president of the Ordo Juris Institute for Legal Culture in Poland. He's an attorney. He's a lecturer of international law at the Collegium Intermarium University. He's appointed to advisory councils of 4 consecutive ministers of justice, both liberal and conservative. He's a member and secretary of the Governmental Monitoring Council for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, and he is regularly listed as one of the most influential Polish lawyers. Politico magazine dubbed him in 2021 as one of the 28 most powerful people in Europe. And since this was Politico, I don't know that they meant that in a good sense, but that seems significant. And finally, Daniela Scalea, who is the founder and president of the Machiavelli Center for Political and Strategic Studies, as you might have guessed, in Italy. He's the author of 5 books, Special Advisor on Migration and Terrorism to the Italian Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2018 to 2019. From 2019 to 2023, he was the head of the Technical Secretariat of the President of the Parliamentary Delegation to the Central European Initiative, and he has a PhD in political studies from the Sapienza University in Rome. And if you're not familiar with the Machiavelli Center, it's been called the #1 think tank for conservatives in Italy. And finally, Gregory Silve, who is a journalist and senior fellow at Mandiner. Gregory studied history and media studies at the Pozsmani Peter Catholic University, where he later earned a PhD in political theory. The Mandiner is a young Hungarian conservative weekly news portal. He's also the author of 6 books. And one of them, The Critique of Gender Theory, has been published in English and is published by our friends at the Center for Fundamental Rights. So please join me in welcoming our panel to the stage. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for making it all this way. I was assuming some of you have been here last week for CPAC, but I understand some of you came specifically for this event, so it's a great honor to have you all here. Danielle, I want to start with you because I think probably Americans are least aware of the role of gender ideology in Italian politics and in Italian culture generally. So just kind of give us a sense of how prevalent this idea is in Italian culture.
Well, also in Italy, the left has fully embraced the gender ideology, so they are demanding for the official recognition of an individual perceived identity, for the criminalization of dissenting views under the guise of transphobia. The cultural left, the leftist media are pushing gender fluidity, especially among the younger generations. The curious thing is that formally they have denied for years the very existence of a gender theory, both because they think that their view is not just a theory but an objective truth, but also because they want to reassure the moderate public opinion. In fact, in Italy, the open followers of gender ideology are quite few in the context of the general population, but they are concentrated in politics, in the academia, and the media. Unfortunately, even fewer are those who openly oppose it. That's why all this propaganda by the media, and in Italy, you should consider that almost all the media on ethical issues are aligned with the left. That's true also for those of the Berlusconi family, for the public broadcaster. All this propaganda has succeeded in shifting to the left year after year the boundaries of what is perceived as common sense on gender by the majority of the population. For example, about a quarter of a century ago, a top political leader, Gianfranco Fini, declared that gay people shouldn't be allowed to teach kids in school. And that notwithstanding, he managed to become Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies, to become Foreign Affairs Minister. Such thing wouldn't be possible anymore today. After 25 years, more or less, according to public opinion surveys in Italy, 60% of the population support same-sex marriage. We have same-sex civil union in Italy, but not marriage. 50% support adoption by same-sex couples. 40% support surrogacy, and 10% declare an LGBTQ identity. This is not only because of media or the cultural industry, also the one of US importation, Netflix, and so on. A major role has been played by schools. There are now in our schools hundreds of projects that are pushing gender ideology on children and teenagers. They are usually hidden in sex education, in training courses, in theatrical performances, distribution of pamphlets. There are about 300 schools which have adopted the alias careers. And quite recently, in the Regional Council of Lombardy, that is one of the main regions administered by the center-right coalition, was proposed a motion against these alias careers. A part of that coalition voted against it, causing it to fail. So gender agenda in Italy is advancing, and unfortunately, a part of its enablers are also among our ranks.
Thank you. So, Gregory, at least on this side of the pond, the perception is that Hungary is very conservative, and so we'd assume that gender ideology hasn't penetrated very far in Hungarian culture and society. But the fact that you work on this and have written a book makes me think that's not correct. So give us a sense of the state of play, specifically not on the question of same-sex marriage, which I think is addressed actually legally in your country, but this question of gender ideology specifically.
So same-sex marriage is not legal at Hungary, but we have same-sex union, civic union, and it's not a topic nowadays. Nowadays, the topic is child protection law at Hungary. But before I speak about that, I shortly would define gender ideology for our purposes. I think gender ideology is basically started as the anthropology of feminism of the second wave, and it's a kind of sharp separation of soul and body. So it's kind of dualism, which opens the door for this kind of subjective identities that you spoke about. And why it is an ideology? Because it is an earthly eschatology. So it tries to bring heaven to earth. If you get a look to some documents which called about gender mainstreaming in the European Union or somewhere else, gender mainstreaming is the implementation plan, let's say, of gender ideology at Hungary or anything else. There is a Wikipedia article about it, and so they just declared that we should Hungarian one declared that we should change even the structure of the family because inequalities can be addressed on that way, not just on the superficial level. So they openly declared that they want to change the society from the very base, let's say. So I guess that's the basics. And Hungary adopted the child protection law 3 years ago in the summer, and this child protection law is partly raised the punishment for pedophiles, and partly is very similar to the Florida law of the Parental Rights in Education Act, because it's banned the LGBTQ propaganda or this kind of things in school and in libraries and in screening on TV for children. So it's for anybody other, you can decide, but it's for the children, and the European Union inevitably just stepped in. The European Commission, which is the kind of governing body of the European Union, sued Hungary at the Court of the European Union for that law. And in this process, 15 member states joined the European Commission to call out Hungary. And why it is interesting, there are many proceedings at the Court of the European Union. So why it's outstanding is that this is the first case in which not just who is sued is not just sued because of breaking some kind of positive laws or written legal texts, but because they invoke that we broke the fundamental values of the European Union. And the fundamental values of the European Union are 6, like freedom, democracy, rule of law, and some others. They are defined on that. They are not defined more specifically. So there is a list in the European Union treaties that those are the basic values of the European Union, and they sue us because we broke some of them in this child protection law, which means that all of the issue is member state stuff. So the European Union does not have a right to legislate on this in these areas. It's remain on the member states. But if they say that you broke the law or broke some fundamental values, they can let's federalize the topic and put up to the more
to Brussels.
To Brussels, yeah.
Effectively. Okay, so I want to make sure that I understand this. So this case has been going on 2 years, I take it, just right after this child protection law passed in Hungary. You compared it to the parental rights and education bill, if folks want to know the comparison.
It's very similar.
Very similar to that. The Court of the European Union has then charged Hungary with a violation of vaguely defined values of the EU, none of which it has. So that's quite consequential and is ongoing, I understand, right?
And if you give me two more sentences, what is interesting is that gender first in the European Union means gender equality between women and men. It was gender equality was on the screen from the very beginnings of the European Union. So from 1957, they have it on their agenda, gender equality, but it in the old sense of between women and men.
Men and women, right.
Labor market, everything else. And in the recent years, it changed, of course, to gender identity. And one of my friends who works for the European Parliament partly and for the Hungarian right is about to publish a study about how the gender as a word appears in the European Parliament texts. And he says that in the last 4 years, from 2,000 resolutions, which the European Parliament adopted, 2,000 resolutions, 108 contains the word LGBTQ. And there are other kind of statistics which are very interesting. So
quite far along, despite perception from a distance. So Jerzy, I'm wondering if you'd tell us a bit about the same situation in Poland, which I honestly think the average American would assume that this ideology is not penetrated very far. But
just today, those months, we are in a very dangerous position in Poland with our conservative government being changed by the liberals and the state being taken over by liberals. Who just trump over all constitutional guarantees and individual rights. During the last few months, they are implementing now the hate speech penal provisions. So yes, we are stepping into the gender ideology time. As it is always in Poland, we are falling behind from the Western fashions for 10 years or 15 years. And the gender ideology was not implemented in Poland in total during the last years. When we speak of gender ideology, it is very interesting that you both mentioned those definitions of gender ideology. And yes, we often invoke this anthropological error that is inside of gender ideology, a very neo-Marxist code, very similar to that one that was defined by John Paul II when he analyzed communism. And this anthropological error was expressed by the World Health Organization that quoted International Planned Parenthood Declaration of Sexual Rights, and the anthropological response to the question, who is a man, sounds sexuality and pleasure deriving from it is a central aspect of being a human. This is this reply to this very fundamental question on anthropology of man. And of course, there's also this expressive individualism as an element of the ideology. And the last part of it is critical theory and a short definition of all social tensions as a simple result of difference between gender roles as a simple outcome of a gender roles. And all those elements are being implemented now into the Polish legal system by the new liberal majority. For 10 years of the conservative government, we are rather free of that. Of course, Poland was under very strong pressure from both European Union, United Nations, other international agendas, and US diplomacy, especially for the last years. When you see now our ministers of the government that are implementing new regulations on education, implementing gender mainstreaming into the education, sexual education into the curricula of primary schools, they meet with Mark Brzeziński to announce that, ambassador of the United States. And he somehow backs all those changes, supports all those changes with his authority and with his presence there. And of course, somehow showing that the United States, that are traditionally an ally of Poland and are perceived as a trusted ally, are supporting those radical revolutionary changes and the social engineering methods that are implemented in Polish law. Poland, contrary to Hungary, is also party to the Istanbul Convention. And of course, the same is experienced by Italy. We are overwatched by Grevio Committee, that international body of experts that looks after all the country state parties to the convention, formulating advices and evaluating the situation in all the countries. Just last year, when Ordo Iuris published and proposed a draft law prohibiting any youth transitioning in Poland, the draft law that was popularly supported by majority of voters of each and every political party, it was not taken to the parliament by none of the parties because of this international pressure. So when we speak of European countries, we have to take into account the limited sovereignty of most of the European countries in this international landscape.
Say just a bit more about the Istanbul Convention for those that are not aware of it. 2011 Commission on, I understand, on violence against women and domestic violence is at least the pretense, but you're saying that's relevant to this.
In fact, the Istanbul Convention that was proposed as a tool against domestic violence and against violence against women is the first ever international binding act that stipulates to implement gender ideology into the state law. In the preamble, it defines all the tensions in the families as resulting from the gender roles and the difference between gender roles of men and women. In the preamble, the convention invokes the history-long struggle for power between men and women and looks for all the sources of those social pathologies in the family itself. In the Article 12, it obliges all the state parties to implement social engineering, to eradicate tradition. It's a quotation. In the Article 14, it obliges all the state parties to implement gender-based violence approach at all levels of curricula in education. And in Article 29, it waives attorney-client privilege in cases concerning violence. So you may see how deep it runs, how deep it forms the society, and also the aim, the final aim of the convention, of course, is to implement this utopian approach of gender ideology, where family is perceived as the source of violence, source of pathology, and where all the natural bounds like marriage, family, natural family, and natural marriage are perceived as a place of a danger, threat for children.
So I just want to underscore that. So this is a convention from 2011 putatively about domestic violence, which everyone opposes and understands is a terrible thing, but defined in terms of essentially conflict theory, in which male and female are eternally in conflict, and it becomes a vehicle for much more than that.
What's interesting, many countries of European Union refused to ratify the convention. Hungary, Slovakia, Czech just 2 weeks ago, Bulgaria, with the Constitutional Court decision. But even though European Union decided to ratify the convention, in order to implement it against the will of the people of those countries that have already refused in democratic procedures to ratify the convention, just because it is the crucial element of implementation of gender mainstreaming and all other policies of European Union with gender budgeting, gender mainstreaming, and the gender ideology going deep, not only in the social issues, but also in trade issues, humanitarian aid, in every policy of European Union.
Thank you so much. A terrific summary. So Ernesto, let's turn to you for the other part of Europe that we have not yet discussed, the Iberian Peninsula. And the panel that's going to follow us is going to focus much more on Central and South America. But speak a little bit about the Iberosphere in contrast or in comparison to the Anglosphere with respect to this question of gender ideology.
Sure. Thank you so much. And first of all, hi to James Carafano. I was late here to arrive, but great to be here. I'm in a kind of odd position because I'm Brazilian, living in the US, and representing a Spanish foundation. So, but that's good because I think that, in a way, this represents the need for this triangular approach for the West. The West, in my view, is a triangle with Europe, North America, and Latin America. And we have to be more and more together. Especially in Latin America, people tend not sometimes to see themselves as part of the West, and this is essential. And the role of Spain and the Sense of Foundation, with whom I'm working now, is essential for that bridge between